Hello, class. Today we're going to discuss inflation. Okay, this inflation is as old as our market system, and this term is highly controversial. Okay, and it has gone modification. The meaning mo omziate meaning te poka modify ani hun kal to a kan en chuan a meaning a po hi adanglam ve zel ani chuanin he inflation low low pound tu ti mayang low a problem low zir chiang tak tu chu neoclassical economists kan tio solo te walras te ho khanita what they meant an mani ina khang economist ho ina inflation anti hi chu galloping rise in prices antita not only that ma til man sang luk tuk til man sang a kha an lo sei ta khang mai ba ka khan why is that the reason anti chuan excessive increase in the quantity of money te paisa tam lu tuk too much money more quantity of money sang lu tuk wang ti te khan an ron ti ta ni chon this problem of inflation has received a more serious attention since 1970s khanin inflation apai mo na kha lozwal le sowa he continuous rise in price kanti general price level lo sang kha it has a common feature for both developed and developing economies. Developed countries ho chau ni lawin developing economies ho po khan he problem hin lo face nual ta ka wang khanin inflation hi ngai poimo lo ni le zual ta ni mo chuan chuanin inflation chu enge ni ta ang kan ti chuanin hey huam zau to kan sei don chuan it means a considerable or persistent rise in general price level atitani general price level khai no thin chianga over a period of time, that is persistent rise in general price level over a period of time. The most acceptable definition tipo universally the accepted definition hi lem lawa he definition it is mostly related to the general rise in the level of prices ti khan persistent more appreciable increase in the level of prices poni thaya persistent poni thaya appreciable poni sustained considerable continuing prolonged prolonged rise in the general level of prices ti khani tani chuanin he definition hi pomtla pui khani me ani so modern economist ho kha chuani kan pom dan tu ro chu any rise in general price level is not inflation kan ti vele ta modern economy so chuan only a persistent prolonged sustained considerable and appreciable rise in general price level can be called inflation til man sang na ran a general man sang na ran kha inflation ani lem lawani so it implies that if that price rise kathil mansa nga kha general price level kha enge sustain mo ve chuk thale chole tia reng ne lawin consistent taka price level sang hi inflation dik tak chu ni e ti in modern economy so chan an lo pom da chuanin hey inflation shang kha definition and pek chu anita Samuelson or Nordas Khanita. A rise in general price, a rise in the general level of prices is inflation, and yeah, and so it means that any rise in general price level over and above the base year level is inflation. So this concept of inflation, which is generally used in the analysis of price behavior, mom, wang khan in definition shang ko om thei in du tu kha in thang thei ma se you always have to remember that that inflation, that general price level, it usually refers to general rise in prices, okay, as measured against our purchasing power or our value of money, okay. Kha inflation nga pom thai chu ni ta ni chuanin there are various type of inflation that we have to be aware of. Here we have in this slide we have open inflation, suppressed inflation, galloping inflation, creeping hyperinflation. Kang inflation sang ka omta mas inflation na te da na kha. There are various ways of it, and then on the degree of government control, and it's one we can. These are the types of inflation that is open inflation and suppressed inflation. On the basis of political conditions, that wartime, peacetime inflation, general rise in price ka danglam thengengi ta atro peacetime le wartime a khan. We have on the basis of scope, sectoral nge comprehensive ma thang ta khanita ni chuan nge open inflation kanti on the basis of government control kanti kha. It refers to the rate where costs rise due to economic trends of spending, products and services. Kanitani. When what this means is that when there is no control on the rising prices, or prices are free to find their own level, the inflation under this condition is called open inflation. And it's and then he claiming post World War period control the regulation of prices ka chu lo thailo in those ni wang khan kaka government can direct measure le indirect measure khamang vetani and think economic policy ka kaka. So in addition to this indirect measure to have monetary the fiscal control mang ten the kan control sang ka amang vetani. So open inflation, suppressed inflation, existing inflation disguised by government price control or other interferences in the economy such as subsidies, their suppression. The mang the prices do take place. This open inflation is somehow a rare phenomenon. Countries facing inflation have suppressed inflation. For example, 7 to 8% inflation in India in 2008 was virtually a suppressed inflation. And we have galloping inflation. These are the types of inflation that we're discussing. So galloping inflation, it refers to the inflation that proceeds at an exceptionally high rate. Normal law taka sang tak ve le khata kal kha exceptionally high kanti khanin galloping inflation kanti chuni. Inflation ama ami I can a double mo a triple digit in mo akal the antinan 8% inflation kan local thin ta ni la ve le khata 16%, 100%, 200% te khan chak takin inflation khalo om ta ni se khatiang a khan galloping inflation kan ti chu anita ni chuanin entena 900% poverty thaya kha kan hriat tur chu German indo pui pakhat na po khan German thilman inflation sang lutuk example pakhat thadau chu in class a po khan ka sei ta in ka shya depression allow in set in khanin Germany a chon chang pakhat one loaf of bread later chuan wheelbarrow hin chianga wheelbarrow a khanin an paisa kha an phur angai tani chang pakhat later chuan chu an paisa hlut lo zia entirna ni tani khangkha that is one example of what we call a galloping inflation. Okay, chuanin we have creeping inflation. There are circumstances where the inflation of a nation increases gradually but continually over time. Actually, admit of creeping. This tends to be typical pattern. Niam lai nei chuang lo mong chang in tikhanin inflation ka sang rat thein doni. Although the increase is relatively small in the short term, as it continues over time, the effect will become greater and greater. Achan chu niam lai anei lo kha chuanin sang ran tlian te in sang ma se kwa raya chuanin lo sang thei ve em ani ma angai tu chan kan pi le pu hun a kan paisa hlut na le tu na hlut na te chu han en thai khin ta ala kha kha example of a creeping inflation chu ni meni ram chuanin the next is we have hyperinflation. In general, a price rise is more than a three-digit rate per annum. This is what we call, for example, a hyperinflation. And then according to some economists, hyperinflation is often defined as inflation that exceeds 50%. 50% per month. An inflation of around 50% per month implies a more than 100-fold increase in the price level over time. This is caused mainly by excessive deficit spending. Deficit spending it is financed. Sarkarin asum nei ai tama man thin hi deficit spending kan ti chu ni ta ni chu finance nan khanin paisa print le to ta ma kha print tam khanin thilman khalo ti sang kholaya paisa lo tam ta ni. So this is done by government, and some people believe that social breakdown leads to hyperinflation. And this hyperinflation, it has its root that it lies in political rather than economic causes. Then Hungary khan inflation 1945 to 46 at one. It has the worst case of hyperinflation ever recorded. That is the rate of inflation average of 20,000% per month for a year. Ma nasat torzia to inchathia mem kangka nasat takha inflation tilman lo sang khama haka hyperinflation kanti. Okay. So now we're going to look at what causes inflation. Okay, what are the reason why we have inflation? All right. Okay, so inflation, why does it happen? It is caused when aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supply of goods and services. And it's a demand to ka kan tam ta zok ta ni supply I can. This leads to the shortage of supply, and this is because of the increase in demand. Let's look at the demand side. Why inflation happens? One thing is, if you look at the slide, there are various factors that affecting demand. And both Keynesians and monetarists believe that inflation is caused by increase in aggregate demand. A demand lama kha alo sana wang khan Keynesian te hau kha monetarist po khanin he demand side lama lo punga wang khanin inflation hi omani tinan lo pu ta chun chu pakhat na chun increase in money supply a pun chu mi pui ku ta khang paisa a om tam tina ni ta so alo kha paisa atam na kha chuan thil man kha asang lo thailo a chan chu demand lo san zo ka supply a khan phak tak lo awang khanin increase in supply of money it leads to increase in aggregate demand. The higher the growth rate money supply tam re reng chuan the higher the rate will be inflation. Modern theories so chuan they do not believe that true inflation start after the full employment level. Panina chuan increase in disposable income there. Income kha mi pui khanin income lo nei tam an income kha lo sang ta se it raises demands for kan kota a om tam suma om tam chuan we demand something tero we demand goods we demand services so this disposable income this may increase with the rise in national income or reduction of taxes kan GDP polo sang thaya disposable income lo om na chan chu chuanin government kan tax khamin lo all ve thei ta ni mo chuanin mi sing kha income re rang chu saving ani lo chong consumption a kal kan ti ta ti khan saving kha kan ti tlem thei ta consumption kha kan ti tam thei ta kan ko ta disposable income lo san kha tin saving mai lo khan in consumption lama kan man tam chuan this will increase the demand side and demand lo sang kha chuan it leads to the increase of inflation rate chuanin deficit financing kha kan say to ang khan government hianin it has various expenditure asum nei jong anei sa jong sang mang khanin an dei seng lo awang khan government resorts to deficit financing that is by borrowing from the public or even by printing more currency right so this raises aggregate demand in relation to aggregate supply thereby leading to inflationary rise in prices this is what we call the deficit induced inflation okay and foreign exchange reserve now so when the demand for domestically produced goods increases in foreign countries Indian thilka foreigner how kan an lo demand via mai the this raises the earnings of industries producing export commodities this in turn creates more demand for goods and services within the economy thereby leading to rise in prices apart from those four there are various the demand factor that affects or that causes inflation black money polo tam view mai the private sector po expand mai the khangkha in line en le donya okay then let's look at the supply side there are certain factors which operate on the opposite side that tends to reduce the aggregate supply okay one is rise in administered prices okay rise in administered prices one thing is government khanin price level kha thirman engemo pakhat manakha ati sang thut thei ta ni amanakha chu tianga chuanin this can lead to an inflation and another is erratic agriculture growth atita third is agricultural price policy chang khani meya inadequate industrial growth khang supply side demand less supply side in equilibrium khanin inflation kha control thaita mase khang lopsided alo om khanin heng inflation te lo na sale zuar thina ne tara chuanin apart from that, we're going that ma akan lo soi to ho kha a general inflation, the causes of inflation kan tu na chuanin more of theoretical causes of inflation that we find in our various books. We're going to discuss it. Okay, theories of inflation na chuan heng ho hi inflation of na chan ma kan hmu thei ta chu ni pakhat na chuan demand pull inflation, second is cost push inflation, and we have built-in inflation. Okay, so let's discuss demand pull inflation. So this is what we call excess demand inflation. That's in a demand side kan angreng. This is the type of inflation that is traditional and most common type of inflation. This takes place when aggregate demand is rising. Demand na sanin kanti khataro, while the available supply of goods is becoming less. Supply ina alo phak lo khan inflation na thin ti khanitani. Goods may be in short supply. Economy of goods omakha lo tlem theitani tara because resources are fully utilized or production cannot be increased rapidly. Railote demand vamit tur khanin rang takin production vasiam kha har ta thinani to meet the increasing demand, especially in India. In kan case sanga phejan population sang chho zer mai sia taro demand kha sang lo thai lo ni tikhanin. So as a result, prices begin to rise in response to a situation often described as too much money chasing too few goods kantika. Too much money chasing too few goods kantika. Nitani heta hianin theory sang ve principal theory kanti ha. Theories of inflation kanti ang khan kan muang so these are the monetarist and view. We have monetarist views, and the Keynes views are one of the two of the most popular ones. They describe this monetarist view kanti chu fragment the kind siang chu tara ni thau kha chuanin monetary term khan aron explain ta ni entinge he inflation low in chor chua da na kha an explain ta chu shan pa theory ve entur khani meya na hang monetary how a fragment aside and pay chuan inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon that rises from a more rapid expansion in the quantity of money than in total output. Economy output nena in relate ai khachuan paisa lama khan a currency lama khan quantity of money lama khanin aput zok dei tani inflation low omna chan. He argues that changes in the quantity of money will work through to cause changes in nominal income, and tenan paisa economy khanin government khan lo print ta se kota paisa lo tam viau thei taro amingin kha inflation everywhere is based on an increased demand for goods and services as people try to spend their cash balances. Paisa kan nei tam chon man na kan hre tam kan ti ta ni taro. So since the demand for money is fairly stable, this excess spending is the outcome of rise in nominal quantity of money supplied to the economy. So, according to the monetarist view, inflation is always a monetary phenomenon. Antitani kinsa vele chuan kinsa le a follower how chuan. Increase in aggregate demand. Antitani aggregate demand alo sa na wangin demand pull inflation hilo omani antitani chu there may be more than one source of demand. Consumer wants more goods and services for consumption purpose. Consumer may baka kham businessman po khanin investment na ti do chan he needs more inputs, so he demands more. To may baka chan government po khan the government may demand more goods and services to meet civil and military requirements of the country. So demand ro po khan a household thaya producers the government po thai tani chuanin kin sale a follower how te kha chuanin he aggregate demand is what comprises of consumption C, investment I, government expenditure G kanti kha in la siang chu tara macroeconomics sa chon lar em. So when the value of this aggregate demand exceeds the value of aggregate supply at full employment level, inflationary gap arises. So this is how Keynes and his followers explain the phenomenon of inflation. So Keynes' theory is basically a short-run analysis in which prices are assumed to be fixed and the prices determined by non-monetary forces. Economy at non-monetary force vanga indeterminate many dia allow assume vang khan kin sakhanin he aggregate demand lo sang zel awang hianin inflation kha omani ti kha aron explain ta ni theories of inflation kan en chuan achiang jok in kan thiang chu cost push inflation ve thung chu it is mostly caused by wage increases, which is enforced by unions, and profit increases by employers. This type of inflation has not been a new phenomenon and was found even during the medieval period. Cost push kanti hian supply side kanti khanita. Hey hian supply side lam hian entinge inflation and run then tier dan ati chuan wage push kan le profit push to the prices avangani. So the basic cause of cost push inflation is a rise in money wages until nan factory athok chuan wage an huta tero kha wage mang khanin union kha factory athok union ho khan if they demand higher and higher wages this will induce the rise in the cost of production tero kha company tang kha factory tang khanin because it is one part of cost in production wage re renga hi kha khanin tilman khalo ti sang ta ni tero. So this increase in prices induced by unions to demand higher wages, this cause if the spiral continues, it leads to cost push or wage push inflation. So it leads to the upward adjustment of wages to compensate for the rise of cost of living index. So khatyanga anloti pun anlo put na khanin supply side lama khanin producer hotan chuan cost khalo ni zelawang khanin this leads to the rise in the price of commodities. Okay, so this can be explained in various ways too. So there are some inflation other than demand pull and cost push inflation, what we call structural inflation. This is basically prominent in South America. There are Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Ramakhan, the developing countries Ramakhan. Structural rigidities kanti hi oma chu not only in South America but other developing countries, structuralist holds one inflation hi thanna ata na poimo ani lotivele thungtani. So according to their view, as the economy develops, rigidities arise which leads to structural inflation. There are increase in non-agricultural incomes. Ram aron develop chuan agriculture may depend to lawin sector dang kha non-agricultural sector ho kha income kha lo sang ta ni. So high accompanied by high growth rate of population that tends to increase the demand for goods. Goods and service demand kalo sangta. The pressure of population growth, rising urban incomes, this leads to a chain reaction mechanism, that is the price of agricultural goods. Mipshing kantam na chuan agricultural goods man kalo sang lo thai lo ta lo a demand kantam awang khan. So, and the general price level and therefore wages. So these are what we call the structural inflation. Okay, so there are various other inflation that if you want you can look up to also. All right. So let's look at what this effect of inflation had upon our market and our economy. Okay. Inflation affects different people differently. This is because of all the fall in the value of money. When price rise or the value of money falls, some groups of economy gain, some lose, some stand in between. So these economic groups in every society, the fixed income group and the flexible income group. So inflation somehow it has various effects in the short run, in the long run, and we're going to look at it. Okay, those effects of inflation. So this inflation, one is we can look at it this way. There is an effect on distribution of income and wealth. The two ways to measure this inflation is, first, on the basis of change in the real value of factor incomes as wages, salaries, rents, interest, dividends, and profits. And the second is on the basis of this size of distribution of income over time as a result of inflation. So inflation brings about shifts in the distribution of real income from those whose economy incomes are relatively inflexible. Hata kan entura chu entinge inflation akan society mi sang kha affect dan pakhat na chuanin kan income le kan hausak na mo income and wealth ta khanin masabera chuan hlo nei salaried person hi lo ni ta se clerk mo teacher mo or any other type of white collar person. What he loses is that this people lose when there is inflation. The reason is that their salaries are slow to adjust when prices are rising. Revision kan pay revision lo te ni ngot lo chan thil man na sana pia nga employer ratan po in government tan po sarkar na po ni ta se thil man tlema lo sana pia nga kan hlo te mo kan sum mu te po ti lo ti pun sak le lo ti danglam sak zel kha ahar and adjust harawang khan inflation alo tam chuanin khang salaried person kan ti ho kha affect ni chapani na chuanin wage earner kan ti he daily rate a Mizorama po kan hmunga daily rate in hlo ang chi te they may gain or they may lose depending on the speed with which their wages adjust. So one important thing is it depends and thing I mean affect dan chu kan income ka inflation alo general price rise alo omre renga ain adjust ve theizel dan na zer kha min affect dan anange is it strong is it not strong mo min affect dan kha kan hlo ina ava in adjust ve theizel ani chuan kan tuar na lo dawanga tero and adjust mo dawani chang kan tor dan kha anna zual don tinani tu mai ba ka chan hey fixed income group kan tiang che a fixed income lo la ang chi te po chuanin businessman at po ni se producer te trader te real estate he chuanin atlang puin thil man na san chuan an hlok ve thin ta ni tero chan agriculturist chuanin hey landlord kan ti te lo nei tu ma peasants te landless worker te mostly landlords lose during rising prices because they get fixed rent. Enge landlord ina a textbook base kan say don chan landlord ho chu an income chu rent tangani kan ti ta atro ani chan rent chu fixed ani ta tianga khanin thil man lo san chuan an effect le zual zel ta ni tero ti khanin government hi ting ni ta ang inflation hen tek chenge government he at one side we can say he is a debtor and he is an creditor ponithaya aba ba petu emo ba nei mi khani vele ve theita yang khana side ta kha adanglam theine debtor ani chuan he gains at the expense of households and as a creditor the real value of his assets decline in the case of government. So thus inflation redistributes income from wage earners and fixed income groups to profit recipient. Inflation na omre reng chuan a fixed income nei ho kha an hlok lo zela profit zong tu te entenan finance anita se investor hote ma ka tang ho kha an hlok zel ani supplier lam te producer hote businessman te hin hlok zok zel tani so so far wealth distributions are concerned the very poor and the very rich are more likely to lose their than middle income group say middle income group ho kha atlang puin a loss tam chun ni ta ni a group a kan then don chuan mi house to le mi ra thei to kha chu a effect tan kha adang lam em lawa chuan a middle income group ho tan khanin inflation hi na se em ni India apo kan thiat tur chu India is basically a middle income society tero so the pakhata chuan the poor hold that little wealth the rich hold vast or substantial part of their wealth, basically in bonds and few debts. Ni hausa chuan a cash in paisan kol lawa tero an invest ve zel ta a bonds ang zong ten security ang zong ten an sum hin nei tlang pui wang khanin thil mana san ra rang chu an hlok zel ta ni. On the other hand, the middle income groups are likely to be heavily in debt and hold some wealth in common stocks and in real assets. Assets kan nei tlem ta middle income ho chuan kha wang khanin real asset kha wang khanin min effect na saberani ti kha pakhat na chuan ni ta se chuan patni na chuanin production a hian enta ila thil mana san hian when price started rising production is encouraged til man sang chuan a hlok kan tia produce kha alo nuam ta a producer khan they might earn profits so they invest more khatianga hey business tarote te pen lo ti to me thei ta atira hlok viawa nuwa expectation mangkhan anticipation mangkhan kan invest ve thin tero tiang chia khan in businessman ho pot khan atira thil inflation low om khanin ati phur ta khanin investment na ron te sang ta economy a khan investment lo sang na chu it increases employment tero circular income kha in en chuan in production kha ti sang ta a employment na ti sang a employment lo sang cha income pa lo sang ta but this is only possible up to full employment level aramina a thei chin ba kha chu a thei lem lo ta ni further increase in investment na om po in he employment full employment level pia lama ti chuan this leads to inflationary pressure within the economy because price rise more than production as the resources are fully employed kan resource aka kan lo utilize vector si ani chuanin production kan ti pum chuan production kha atam ya demand kha lo om thei ta lo ta thil man kha lo sang ta ni so this adversely affects production after the level of full employment so this what will happen this will lead to misallocation of resources kanti producer khanin kha resource kha production of essential to non-essential lama khan paying tadai thei ta ni so that he earns higher profits so there could be change in the system of transaction inflation leads to changes in transaction patterns of producers they hold a smaller stock of real money holdings against unexpected and this the third is reduction in production and the fall in quality hoarding te promote thea black marketing te promote thei ta ni kha kan full employment level aya tam kan invest le chuan and also it can leads to reduction in saving when price rises rapidly saving declines okay because more money is needed to buy goods and services so saving at lem chuan investment economy angzong pana thei ta lo ta ni taro so this is what the inflation had its effect on production sector and apart from this economy other effects we have is government okay government ate khanin inflation khanin it affects government in various ways it helps government in financing its activities to inflationary finance as money incomes of the people increase government collects more taxes tera mipui income kan mu tam chuan tax kan mu tam ve a chuan in government po kha lo ho sa set ta a revenue po lo pung ta when there is price rise but the real burden of public debt decreases when price are rising zia chu tax collect tam chuan government po ba kha nei tlem lo tinan ta ni ma se when government expenses also increases with the rising cost of public projects kha tax bang kha a collect kha project sang nei ve thei ta ni taro so this might chu mai ba ka chuan administrative expense te po kha sarkar nge hlo te po kha lo ni ta se khanin expenditure khati pung ve ta ni on the whole government gains under inflation because rising wages and profits spread an illusion of prosperity within the country in tihialani chuan in government mei pa ka hianin balance of payment ta hian inflation hian a effect thui ve em ani So inflation involves sacrificing of the advantage of international specialization and division of labor. It affects adversely the balance of payment of a country. Balance of payment affect thalawani. So when price rise more rapidly in a home country, India akhanin thilman lo sang ta se foreign country kamvador ram foreign ramami ai khanin kan thilman kha sang ta se kan product kha atau ta jok ta ni as compared to our foreign products tara. So this tends to increase imports and reduce exports ka kan rama thil in ang thau si kha kan rama mi kha atau jok chuan ram danga mi lei mei te kha although ta chu wangin it increase imports and reduce exports. Exports kan ram tan export at claim chuan kan earning claim tina chu kan balance of payment kha affect dan kha it becomes unfavorable. So this happens only when the countries follows a fixed exchange rate policy. Fixed exchange rate policy kan follow ni chuan kan ram khan kha inflation na kha min effect na ani ma se flexible exchange rate system kan man ve thung chuan flexible ani chuan kan currency a kha international market a khanin ein thak dollar ein thak dangla mangzel khan thil kan currency pokhain thak ve ti na ni me ya taro kha wang khanin khatiang in thak ve zel ani kha chuanin min effect da na kha athalo zong in ane lawani. Okay, so it depends on our economic setup. Chuanin chu mai pa ka chun exchange rate a po hian when price rise more rapidly in the home country than in foreign countries, it lowers the exchange rate in relation to foreign currency. Kan currency po khalo effect thai ni. So may baka chuan extra daw lek chu social le kan political le kan social setup pa po khanin inflation hian min lo effect ve thai ni chu socially chuanin inflation is very harmful kan ti thei. So that means inflation kha na china kan soi to ang khanin mi hausa le mi re thei in kar kha a thliar sang ta ni mo kha socially chuan it causes discontentment among the population. So this rising thil manasan chuan it is a cost of living cost of living index ka sang ti na ni ta hey India rama po state tin han enila kan cost of living index kha adanglam ve kani entinan mizoram rent in luaman le ko ta Bangalore in luaman te chu danglam de ni taro athaddan in ang thausia khan tiang khang cost of living min effect thei ta ni. So this leads to sometimes when inflation is too much, it leads to strikes and unwanted altercation between the masses and the other side. Okay, so this leads to the loss of production, industry and and people resort to hoarding ka man koma enge paisa ati thi chungchanga te po khan mo since Indian economy is mostly a cash economy kan ti ka paisa akol mai khalo hlok to jok ta ni taro chon black market te allow promote ta manufacturing of substandard commodities, speculation, corruption in every walk of life. All this reduces the efficiency of the economy. So politically, rising prices also encourage agitation and protest by political parties opposed to the government. And if they gather momentum and become unhandy, they may bring the downfall of the government. Political life khanin he inflation hianin protest kha anasat thei awang khanin instability in our political life kha athlen ve thei ni ro khaka tlema ava extra the effect of inflation kan ti chuan chu ni ta ni. So the next is how this inflation is measured. There are two ways, that is consumer price index and producers price index. In a consumer price index, a measure of price change in consumer goods and services are selected. Some basic goods are selected, and with this consumer price index, we measure price change from the perspective of the purchaser, that is consumer, a perspective atang khan thilman san zong en nanitani. So producer price index kan ti chuan it measures domestic producers of goods and services. It is a price change from the perspective of the producer. Okay, so this is the example of inflation za takha en taula second roa hian inflation nakha sangni pasaria chuan 5.4 ania sangni som pakhata kan en chuan 6.1 ni ta ni heta hianin consumer price index kha asang jok zel ani tro chuan wholesale price index kha PPI kan tin en khan ang thau ta ni an tikhanin are takha tiang hian ani tlang pui ni tikha aron tilang ve rim shimani chuanin India rambi ka hian entai la inflation rate hi government of India has always been the impression that some inflationary rise in price is inherent to rapid economic development, and GDP growth rate has been around 7 to 8%, 8 to 9, and it has formulated and perfected various policies to keep inflation in check. And apart from that, RBI has always given the impression that by using monetary policy of rate of interest and cash reserve ratio, it could control the volume of money supply and volume of demand so as to maintain the annual rate of inflation around 5%. And this range of growth of prices has occurred many times in the past, but the government managed to control them. However, this inflation is not getting control and prices are rising unabated. However, if we look at it, we find non-agricultural commodities also joining the bandwagon and have started contributing to inflation. India ramachon agricultural commodities so khanin inflation thlentam tu berchu nita ma se anua sanghi som nuwa po khanin agricultural products mai ni lo dang ho po khan inflation run thlen tu khan ron nita ni chung pakhat chu gas hey petrol kan tiang chi te hian thilman ron ti sang tu chu nita ni. So in order to promote the welfare of common man, inflation in essential commodities directly affects the purchasing power of common man, and the government was forced to take action to check inflation, even if its macroeconomic impact is not large. So the policy to control the rise in prices of essential goods should be solely to supply management. And looking after this, we're going to say the measure of how to control what the government or other agencies have been using to control this inflation. Strong inflation lo nang khanin measure shang kham hang ve ta ni economy khanin ma government te RBI te khan India ram chuanin heng te hi a policy man chu ni ta ni monetary measure hi enta ila credit control, demonetization of currency, issue of new currency mang ti hian inflation sang lu tuk tur khan ron control thin ani tara. So it aims at this monetary measure or policy aims at reducing money income. Okay, one thing is credit control. This is one very important measure. The central bank of the country adopts a number of methods to control the quantity and the quality of credit. For this purpose, it raises bank rates, sells securities in open markets, it raises reserve ratio, adopts a number of selective credit control measures. And then credit control to in chefek kanga hey bank hianin loan an pe thei ta ni tara loan an pe chuak thei ta mi pui ko ta khanin control na omre ren lawa loan du tu kha han pe chuak thei ta se mi pui ko ta khan sum kha tam don lu tuk ta ni khami control nan khan government khan in bank rate te siam ta chuan in reserve ratio te siama khang chu in lo zirvek to tura nga ya zai tam tal o taila heng monetary policy sometimes may not be effective in controlling inflation if inflation is due to cost push inflation and then demand side lam atanga inflation ron thleng kha ni lo ta se cost mo supply side lam cost push lam atanga ron thleng ani kha chuanin inflation na kha a control thei don talo ta ni monetary measure mang khan tera he credit control measure mang khan a control thei talo ta ni chuanin demonetization of currency atia it is one monetary measure is to demonetize currency of higher denomination. Demonetization to in chefek kangatro in experience poka. Such measure is usually adopted there when there is abundance of black money in a country. An experience factor chuanin. And the most extreme monetary measure is the issue of new currency in place of the old currency. Under this system, one new note is exchanged for a number of notes of the old currency. The value of bank deposits is also fixed accordingly. Such a measure is adopted when there is excessive issue of notes and there is hyperinflation in the economy. Hyperinflation om hian he measure him han tlang poini. But it is inequitable for it hurts the small depositors the most. Ahman no hun le ahun kaum ve tani. Chuanin we have second we have the control of inflation, we have fiscal measure, fiscal policy, that is reduction in unnecessary expenditure. Monetary policy alone is incapable of controlling inflation. It should therefore be a fiscal supplemented by a fiscal measure. This is highly effective for controlling government expenditure. Government expenditure, personal consumption expenditure, and public and private investment. So these are the various measures used in fiscal control of inflation. One is reduction in unnecessary expenditure. Government kan in expenditure anga lutuk chuan kan soi to ang khan government ina sumam han tam re ren chomi pui ko ta paisa tam thin ani tara. So in this way it is important for government to reduce the expenditure. But it is not easy to cut government expenditure, though this measure is always welcome. But it becomes difficult to distinguish between essential and non-essential expenditure. Government expenditure control may hi harviawani. Chuanin nina chan increase in taxes. Ipui kuta sum tamlu tuk titlem all samber zu tax ani. Tara. So corporate emo, personal emo, commodity tax po ka. Anti san vek chuanin. Rate of tax when this is controlled, it is used to control inflation. But taxes should not be a control of tumlai kan. It should not government na khana hriat ve tur chu angai poimo tur chu it should not be so high. Okay, tax ati tamlu tu kha chuan saving ati tle manga investment ati buai anga production ati buai le don sia. So the tax system should provide larger incentives to those who save, invest and produce more. So to bring more revenue into the tax net, the government should penalize tax evaders by imposing heavy fines. Okay, chuan in to may baka we increase savings. Another measure is to increase savings of the people. Chu mipui ina vek le khata saving ti tam tur chuan in government khanin interest rate te ti sang do ne mani ti khani ta ni tiang khanin that is how measure to control the inflation. Surplus budget, an important measure is to adopt anti-inflationary budgetary policy. The government, what this means is should give up deficit financing. Deficit financing here, kalsan se surplus budget in accounts are maintained ta se more. Ani chuan in this it means collecting more revenues and spending less. On zia taka chu surplus budget ti khan chung chu a resort chuan in inflation hi tam taka control theini chuan in public debt te it should stop. Government should stop repayment of public debt and postpone it to some future till inflationary pressure. Inflation asan lai tak chuan public debt takha rule lo ta se. This way you can control the inflationary pressure within the economy. Okay, so like monetary measure, fiscal measure alone cannot help in controlling inflation. They should be supplemented by monetary, non-monetary and non-fiscal measures. So other measures apart from this monetary and fiscal, there are other measures to curtail inflation. One is to increase production. Kan sei to ang khan demand sang zo kan titani tara demand lo sang zo khachuan. One thing it has to do is to increase production. This is one of the foremost measure to control inflation is to increase production of essential consumer goods. Atlang puing consumer goods khan food te, clothing te, oil te, sugar, vegetable oils, etc. Tiang hau zong zong kha production akha tipung turani. Tara if there is need, raw materials for such products may be imported or preferential basis to increase the production of essential commodities. Okay, and rational wage policy. Another important is to adopt a rational wage and income policy. So to control to control inflation, the government should freeze wages, income, profit. This type of drastic measure can be adopted for a short period, but for workers and industrialists. And the best course is to link increase in wages to increase productivity. Okay, if we control wages and at the same time increase productivity, then production of goods in the economy can be increased. All right, and apart from that, we have price control, rationing, and all that. So this are various examples of how to control inflation in the economy. So from the various monetary, fiscal and other measures we've discussed, it becomes clear that to control inflation, the government should adopt all measures simultaneously. Vekata khanin monetary, fiscal measure sang kha inflation alawam khan among kop factor ani ma inflation is like this, and the government has to control this inflation. So that is all for this slide. I will be giving you other more theoretical based inflation and a